She accidentally sent a raw, late-night confession to a ruthless Korean mafia boss. What he did next shocked her. It all started on a rain-slicked Tuesday night when Sienna meant to log her deepest, most shameful thoughts into a private diary app. Instead, a terrifying misclick sent her raw obsession directly to the private line of Kwon Tae-jin, the controlled, powerful, and intimidating head of the city's most dangerous syndicate. One late-night error changed everything. If you're ready for this dark corporate noir, rate the tension from 1 to 10 in the comments. Sienna Vale, 29 years old, sharp but drowning in her family's mounting debts, was running on double-shot espressos and pure anxiety that morning. With her auburn hair pulled back and her round glasses sliding down her nose, she was barely holding on as an assistant when Gwen, the office's queen of corporate sabotage, appeared. Impeccably dressed and hunting for a weakness, Gwen viewed Sienna's drive as a personal offense. "Where is the Q3 distribution plan?" she asked, her voice a polished trap. Sienna didn't flinch, despite the secret message now sitting on a mafia boss's phone. "I worked until 4 a.m. It's nearly finished," Sienna replied, her voice steady but stripped of its usual warmth. Gwen blinked, her expression shifting to bored disdain. "Then maybe this role is too much for you. You're underwhelming at best." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking like a countdown towards Sienna's. The morning air in the corporate headquarters felt like dry ice, sharp and suffocating, as Sienna Vale sat at her desk with her auburn hair pulled back into a tight, practical bun. Her round glasses were fogged from the heat of her own skin, and her heart performed a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Every time the internal chat system pinged, she flinched, her eyes widening in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The sent receipt on her phone was a death warrant. The late-night confession, intended for the digital void of a diary, was now sitting on the private line of Kwon Tae-jin, a man whose very name caused chairs to shift and postures to straighten whenever he moved through the corridors. She had spent the last 3 hours in a state of catastrophic panic, her hand frequently flying to cover her mouth as she replayed the words she had typed in a moment of wine-induced recklessness. She had called him a locked vault, a scary cousin of gravity, and had detailed dreams that were far too vivid for a junior assistant to harbor about the head of a global empire. She expected a security detail to escort her out, or perhaps for the floor to simply open up and swallow her whole. Instead, the intercom on her desk crackled to life with a clipped, professional tone. "Miss Vale?" The voice of Tae-jin's executive assistant was like a blade. "Mr. Kwon would like to see you in the corner office, immediately." Sienna arose, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She walked toward the executive elevator, feeling the weight of the underdog narrative she had suddenly been thrust into. As the doors slid open on the top floor, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air here didn't smell like cheap office coffee or stress. It smelt faintly of sandalwood, a rich masculine scent that Tae-jin insisted upon. The office was an elegant blend of minimalism and masculine taste, where every model sailboat and folder was meticulously positioned by a man who preferred absolute order and control. She knocked once, her spine straight despite the fact that her soul was trying to flee her body. "Come in." The voice was exactly as she had described it in her accidental message, calm, deep, and possessing a confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Sienna stepped inside, her cheeks burning like a furnace as she met the gaze of the man sitting behind the sleek desk. Kwon Tae-jin didn't rise. He sat with a mechanical grace, his dark-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he stared at the smartphone in his hand, the same phone that held her most shameful secrets. He was unsmiling, his sharp features and slick black hair giving him the appearance of a predator who had found a particularly interesting prey. Sienna stood before him, her hands cold and her voice barely above a whisper. "You asked for me, sir." He didn't answer right away. He watched her sharply, as if comparing the terrified, auburn-haired woman in front of him to the raw, reckless honesty of the message he had received. The silence in the room was so dense it felt like a physical weight, the kind of silence that commanded more attention than noise ever could. Sienna inhaled sharply, ready to plead, to explain that she was just an average employee who had made a catastrophic mistake. "Miss Vale," Quan Tae-jin finally spoke, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling, unreadable composure. "I reviewed your correspondence this morning." Sienna's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Quan, I am so sorry. It was a mistake. I never intended for you to see that." Instead of the explosive anger or the cold dismissal she had prepared for, Tae-jin leaned forward just a little, his glacier blue eyes narrowing. He wasn't yelling, he looked unsettlingly controlled. He placed his phone face down on the desk with a deliberate click. "You called me a locked vault. You claimed that the halls of this company are so sterile you can hear your thoughts echo. And then you made several very specific observations about your own isolation." Sienna wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. "I was tired, I wasn't thinking." "On the contrary," Tae-jin countered, a faint, unreadable smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "I think you were thinking quite clearly, Sienna. You have a certain reckless honesty, a fire that most of the dulled, routine-obsessed people in this building lack." He stood up, moving with a clean, slow space that made the air in the room feel even thinner. He walked around the desk until he was standing just inches from her, the scent of sandalwood now overwhelming her senses. He was taller and scarier in person, a man who had built an empire from nothing through relentless control. He whispered, "I don't fire people for being honest, but I do test them. You claim to see things others don't. You claim to want more than this sterile environment offers." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently tilted her chin upward with 2 fingers, forcing her to look into the depths of his ice-cold eyes. "Here is my move, Sienna. I have a high-stakes project, a distribution plan for our new smart home tech that needs a narrative, not just numbers. My current directors are too uninspired to see the human angle. You have until tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. sharp, to bring me a presentation that is as bold and raw as that confession you sent me." Sienna blinked, her mind reeling. "A presentation? But I'm just an assistant." "If you're as brilliant as your message suggests, the title won't matter. But if you fail, or if you're as average as your manager believes, then we will discuss the human resources consequences of your inappropriate communications." He let go of her chin and stepped back, dismissing her with a single sharp nod. "You wanted to be seen, Miss Vale. Now show me if you're worth looking at." Sienna turned and walked out of the office, her head spinning and her heart hammering. She expected a crime scene. Instead, she had been given a lethal opportunity. As she reached her desk, she didn't grab her coat to flee. She grabbed her laptop. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a flickering, desperate fire. The silence of Sienna's small apartment was a stark contrast to the sandalwood-scented pressure of the top floor, yet the air felt just as thin. She sat huddled over her laptop, her auburn hair now escaping its practical bun in wild, frizzy strands, her round glasses reflecting the harsh blue light of the screen. It was 3:15 a.m., the exact hour her late-night confession had been sent the night before. A mistake that should have ended her career, but had instead become a lethal dare. Her heart was still performing that uneven, frantic rhythm, but the paralyzing, catastrophic thinking was slowly being replaced by a desperate, flickering fire. Quan Tae-jin hadn't asked for a standard corporate summary. He had demanded a killer presentation that mirrored the reckless honesty of her accidental message. She knew he was testing her pulse, searching for a sign that she was more than just another average employee, dulled by routine. Every time her eyelids grew heavy, his voice echoed in her mind, velvety, deep, and chillingly controlled, reminding her that the consequences of failure were far more severe than a simple HR meeting. By 4 a.m., her eyes were bloodshot and her hands were sore from the relentless rhythm of typing, yet she didn't stop. She scrapped 3 different drafts, realizing to reach a man like Tae-jin, she couldn't hide behind consumer behavior charts alone. She had to weave a narrative. Her project, the Smart Home Tech Guardian of the Inner Sanctum, was a radical departure from the uninspired proposals Gwen had previously shut down. While the rest of the marketing team chased the tech-savvy elite, Sienna focused on the hesitant, overwhelmed majority, people who, like her, felt small in a city that never slowed down. She poured her own isolation into the strategy, treating the technology not as a luxury, but as a shield for one's private world. It was raw, it was bold, and it was exactly the kind of insight Tae-jin had challenged her to produce. Morning arrived with a cold, gray light that slapped her cheeks as she stepped out of her building. She had stayed up all night, her body running on pure adrenaline and double-shot espressos. When she walked into the office at 9:55 a.m., the atmosphere was buzzing and stiff. Gwen was already there, sipping coffee with a forced curiosity, her eyes fixed squarely on Sienna's disheveled appearance. Sienna didn't make eye contact. She didn't want to ruin the surprise or allow Gwen's passive-aggressive warfare to shake her focus. She marched toward the executive elevator, her spine straight, and her heart somewhere near her throat. The top floor smelled as it always did, a blend of minimalism and expensive sandalwood. As she entered the corner office, Tae-jin was already seated, his fingers laced and his glacial blue eyes tracking her every move. He didn't rise, nor did he offer praise or criticism as she began to speak. For the first few slides, her voice wavered, the catastrophic fear threatening to dissolve her resolve. But then, something shifted. She remembered the fire she had felt when she typed that confession, the rhythm she had found in the middle of the night, and her words became clear and confident. She moved between consumer behavior charts and case studies with a mechanical grace that mirrored his own, layering her voice with an energy that finally brought heat to the sterile room. She spoke of making complex simple and the power of narrative-based marketing, her passion chipping away at the silent armor Tae-jin wore. Across the desk, Tae-jin watched her with unreadable composure. He tried very hard to maintain his professional distance, but it was impossible to ignore the words that launched this entire trial, especially the late-night confession about her dreams. The thought of her shameful honesty popped into his head more than once, and every time he had to consciously tighten his jaw to stop the curve of his lips. He saw the exhaustion underneath her soft expression, but he also saw the fighter she was trying to become. When she finally finished, Sienna stood expectant, her hands clasped and her chest heaving with the effort of her midnight trial. The silence returned, heavy and aching. Tae-jin was silent for a beat. Then he slowly closed the folder in front of him. He didn't offer a pulse of applause, but something in his eyes had changed, a shift from cold observation to a dark, simmering interest. "Thank you, Miss Vale," he said, his voice dropping to that velvety low that made her knees weak. Sienna walked out of the office like she had been spun around, a fire brewing in her chest that had nothing to do with her manager's cruelty and everything to do with the man behind the desk. She had survived the dare, but as she reached the elevator, she realized the dragon wasn't finished with her. He was just beginning to play. The days following the midnight trial were a blur of adrenaline and looming dread, but the night of the Kwan Enterprises anniversary gala arrived with a different kind of weight. Sienna Vale stood before her mirror, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the straps of a black silk dress that fit her as if it had been sculpted for her body. She had traded her usual office cardigans for this transformation, her auburn hair falling in soft curls over her shoulders instead of her usual tight, practical bun. Her round glasses remained, but they felt less like a shield and more like a deliberate, intellectual contrast to the smoky makeup that made her green eyes look brighter than they ever had under the harsh fluorescent lights of the marketing department. The venue was a boutique hotel in the heart of the city, a space transformed into a sea of candlelight, white flowers, and minimalist gold details. As Sienna stepped out of her cab and into the crisp night air, she felt the eyes of the city on her, or perhaps it was just the phantom weight of one specific pair of eyes. She linked her arm through her friend's John's, who let out a dramatic whistle at her transformation, but Sienna barely heard him. Her mind was already inside the ballroom, searching for the man who had challenged her to prove she wasn't average. The room buzzed with the sound of silver trays, champagne flutes, and the low, practiced laughter of 500 employees. Sienna moved through the crowd, feeling like a different woman entirely. She spotted Gwen across the room, dressed in a striking red dress that screamed for attention as she orbited the senior executives like a fly on the spotlight. Sienna, however, remained on the periphery, nursing a glass of champagne, while her soul felt the familiar, heavy pull of a predatory presence. Then she saw him. Kwon Tae-jin was standing at the far end of the room, looking every bit the lethal enigma she had described in her accidental text. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his sharp features and slick black hair, his presence commanding the room with a silence that was louder than the surrounding chatter. As Sienna took a sip of her drink, his glacier eyes shifted, locking on hers across the expanse of the ballroom. Sienna felt her chest tighten, a spark like static electricity flashing through her body, even from a distance. She offered a small, polite nod, but he didn't return it. Instead, he watched her with a chilling, unreadable composure that made her feel as though he were comparing the woman in the black dress to the terrified assistant who had stood in his office just 48 hours prior. The announcement for dinner broke the tension, and the guests were informed that departments would be mixed to encourage interdepartmental connection. Sienna made her way to the seating list, her heart stalling when she found her name: Vale, Sienna, Table 1. Table 1 was placed dead center, right in front of the stage, reserved for the company's highest-ranking leaders. Sienna approached the table with shaky breaths, finding herself seated next to Margot, Tae-jin's executive assistant. The seat to her right remained empty until the last moment. Then, the chair shifted. Sienna didn't have to look up to know who it was. The air around her suddenly smelled of rich, masculine sandalwood. Tae-jin sat down with a mechanical grace, adjusting his suit jacket before turning slightly toward her. "Good evening, Miss Vale," he said, his voice a velvety, deep low that made the truffle risotto in front of her feel entirely secondary. "Good evening, Mr. Kwon," she managed, her cheeks burning as she adjusted her napkin for the third time. The dinner was a masterclass in suppressed tension. As the first course was served, a beautifully plated dish that Tae-jin encouraged her to try, with a terrifyingly soft "try it," Sienna could feel his eyes tracking her every move. When she opted for water instead of the wine being served, he raised an eyebrow, his unsmiling face showing a flicker of curiosity. "No wine?" he asked, his gaze never wavering. "I don't handle it well," she whispered, her green eyes locking on his glacial ones. "I like that you know your limits, Sienna," he replied, his tone dropping the niceties for a second of raw intimacy. "But tonight we relax. Loosen up." He topped up a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon for her himself, his hand overlapping hers for a fleeting second as they both reached for the bottle. The contact sent a jolt through her body, her breath catching as she stared at their overlapping hands, the vulnerable office worker and the controlled mafia boss. "Good teamwork," he quipped, a subtle, unreadable smile finally flickering at the corner of his mouth as he slid his hand away. Sienna downed half the glass in a single gulp, her nerves melting into a warm, dangerous fuzziness that made her movements feel less like her own. She looked across the room to see Gwen watching them with eyes narrowed in a suspicious smirk. Sienna didn't care. As Tae-jin rose to deliver the anniversary speech, his presence magnetic and authoritative under the spotlight, she realized the reveal wasn't just about her dress. It was about the fact that for the first time, she was being seen by the only man that mattered. The morning after the gala, the warm glow of the previous night's connection had been replaced by a sharp, focused determination. Sienna Vale arrived at her desk earlier than usual, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she finalized the packaging strategy and consumer expansion plan that Tae-jin had challenged her to perfect. She felt a new sense of belonging, a belief that her voice finally mattered in the sterile, high-pressure halls of Kwon Enterprises. However, in her rush to grab a celebratory coffee with John, she left her workstation for only a few minutes, forgetting to lock her screen. Gwen noticed the oversight immediately. The manager's jealousy had been festering since seeing Sienna seated at table 1, and the sight of the glowing folders on the screen provided the perfect weapon. With a self-satisfied smirk and a quick glance over her shoulder, Gwen plugged in a flash drive. She copied the Q3 pitch and the consumer channel expansion files, slipping the drive into her blazer pocket with practiced ease. She had no idea that Taejin had already seen the work. She only saw an opportunity to eliminate a threat she deemed underwhelming. The atmosphere in the office shifted within hours, turning from a post-gala high into a cold, crawling dread. An emergency meeting notification hit Sienna's phone, calling for mandatory attendance in the boardroom. When she arrived, the blinds were shut, and the room was thick with a silence that felt like a physical weight. Kwon Tae-jin walked in moments later. He didn't smile, and he didn't acknowledge Sienna's presence. He moved to the head of the table with mechanical grace, closing a folder with slow, deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice was like dry ice, calm, even, and terrifyingly controlled. Earlier that morning, he announced, Rival Tech had made a surprise announcement. They had launched a product that was an exact replica of their own. A collective gasp rippled through the room, but Sienna felt the air ripped from her lungs. Taejin leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He stated that they didn't just beat the company to market, they had stolen the concept, the marketing language, and the distribution plan, even down to the packaging. He straightened up, his gaze fixing on Sienna with an unreadable, lethal intensity. He noted that the information was only shared between two departments, meaning someone in the room had betrayed them. Sienna's heart thudded like a war drum in her chest. She looked at Taejin, searching for the man who had shared a static spark with her just hours before, but he was gone. In his place was the MAFIA boss, a man who viewed the breach of proprietary data as an unforgivable betrayal. He addressed her directly, noting that he had reviewed her proposal that morning and found the packaging strategy and consumer angle impressive. The words should have been praise, but they landed like a slap. He pointed out the problem. Rival Tech's launch was exactly what she had presented. The room tightened around her as Gwen let out a theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. All eyes locked on Sienna, who sat frozen, her hands trembling beneath the table. She looked at Taejin, pleading with her eyes for him to see the truth, but his silence was unbearable. He didn't speak, he simply watched her betrayal in a silence that felt more final than any accusation. Sienna choked on her words, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to claim her innocence, but the suspicion had already shifted firmly onto her shoulders. Taejin remained still and cold, his eyes dropped to the floor as if he couldn't bear to look at her. In that boardroom, the romantic tension of the gala was extinguished, replaced by the lethal reality of a frame-up that threatened to destroy everything she had fought for. Sienna felt the air in the boardroom turn to ice as the silence of Kwon Tae-in pressed against her like a physical force. Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and humiliating, as she watched the unreadable glacial blue of his gaze shift back to the screen without a single word in her defense. She stood up, her movements quiet but fueled by a sudden, jagged firmness, and walked out of the boardroom as the murmurs of her colleagues turned into a wall of judgment. Back at her desk, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved with a cold, sharp precision across the keyboard as she typed her resignation, stating clearly that she no longer felt her work was valued in a place where theft was met with silence. She printed it, signed it with a hand that finally stopped trembling, and walked straight to Gwen's desk. Gwen looked up with a saccharine, self-satisfied smirk, but Sienna merely placed the envelope down and left the building without a word. The Boston air was brisk, snapping against her cheeks as she wandered the streets feeling invisible and small against the towering glass of the city. Her phone rang an hour later, an unknown number blinking on the screen. When she answered, a calm, clipped voice, Taejin's executive assistant, informed her that he wanted to see her immediately. When Sienna stepped back into the sandalwood-scented vault of his office, her shoulders were square and her jaw was tight. She didn't greet him or take a seat. She simply stood in the center of the room, waiting. Taejin glanced up from his screen, his expression a storm of mechanical grace. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" he asked, his voice like dry ice. "I've submitted my resignation effective immediately," Sienna replied, her voice clipped. Taejin leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. That's it? You're not going to fight for it? The question felt like a blade. Sienna's breath caught, the hurt of the afternoon finally boiling over. Gwen stole my project, she snapped. You saw it. She stood there and presented my work as hers, and you said nothing. Taejin's gaze remained cold, an analytical mask that offered no comfort. And how would I know it was your project and not hers? Sienna took a step forward, her heart thudding against her ribs. I showed it to you. I sat in this office and walked you through every detail. Exactly, he replied smoothly, his voice dropping to a velvety, dangerous low. You showed it to me. She's been a director for years. If this meant so much to you, why didn't you speak up in that room? Why didn't you defend it? Sienna's lip trembled as she realized he was testing her, looking for a fighter where she had only ever been an assistant. I didn't want to cause drama, she whispered, her voice cracking as she took a shaky step back. No, Taejin said, his eyes flashing with a sudden sharp disappointment. You didn't want to take a risk. That's not the kind of person this company or I need. If you're not willing to claim what's yours, you're not ready for a seat at the table. Sienna stood there stunned, the weight of his judgment feeling like a physical blow. She turned towards the door, her hand on the handle, but then she stopped. A fire she hadn't known she possessed flared to life, and she spun back to face him. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Mr. Kwan, she blurted, her green eyes locking on his glacier ones. You rattle me, you make me tense, and those eyes, they get to me. I admit it. I can never tell if you hate me or if you're interested, but I'm done being your bait. She looked him dead in the face, her voice rising with a fierce new empowerment. I'm not afraid of those cold eyes anymore. With a final echoing crash, she slammed the door behind her, leaving the dragon alone in his sterile, sandalwood-scented silence. The rain lashed against the windows of Sienna's small apartment, a somber echo to the chaos of the afternoon. She was frantically throwing her clothes into a suitcase, her auburn hair still damp from a frantic shower, and her eyes puffy from the tears she had finally allowed to fall in the privacy of her own home. Her plan was simple: flee to her mother's house in Rowley, escape the sterile glass towers of the city, and try to forget the man who had used her as a pawn in his corporate games. The land her father had left behind was slipping through her fingers, and now her career was a pile of ashes. When the buzzer rang, she ignored it, but the persistent, heavy knock at her door 10 minutes later was impossible to shut out. She cracked the door open, the security chains still engaged, and froze. Standing in the dim hallway was Kwan Taejin. He looked entirely out of place against the peeling wallpaper of the modest apartment building, his charcoal suit still wet from the storm. His sharp features were framed by the shadows of the stairwell, but his deep eyes were no longer the ice-cold glaciers she had described in her message. They were intense, searching, and undeniably heavy with something she couldn't name. Sienna, he said, his voice a low, commanding vibration that seemed to bypass her defenses. We need to talk. She closed the door just long enough to slide off the chain, her heart thudding so loudly it felt like it would crack her ribs. She stood before him in her robe, wet hair clinging to her shoulders, feeling exposed in a way that went beyond her lack of professional attire. Taejin stepped into the room, his presence instantly shrinking the small space, the rich scent of his sandalwood cologne clashing with the mundane smells of her apartment. He didn't wait for her to speak. I know you didn't do it, he said, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. Sienna didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, a fresh wave of hurt washed over her. You let me go through that, she whispered, her voice raw and defiant. You let me be humiliated in front of the entire board just to draw someone out? She gestured toward her half-packed suitcase, her eyes flashing behind her round glasses. I was bait, a random, replaceable employee turned into a trap so you could catch your mole. Taejin moved closer, his mechanical grace replaced by a sudden, jagged intensity. No, he countered, his gaze locking onto hers. The incident unfolded the way it did, and I realized that if the real culprit thought their plan had worked perfectly, they would get sloppy. I needed them to believe I had turned on you. He reached out, his fingers brushing the air between them as if he wanted to touch her, but he feared she would shatter. "I burned the bridge for you," she said, her voice fighting. "You used me to burn that bridge. It's done. I'm leaving." "But you aren't leaving because of the job," he said, his gaze locking on hers. "You're leaving because of..." The morning air in the corporate lobby was thick with a different kind of silence, not the usual sterile quiet, but the heavy, electric stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Sienna Vale walked through the glass doors with her head held high, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't think she could ever return to this building after the humiliation of the boardroom, but Kwon Tae-jin's words from the previous night, the raw, whispered promise that he was here for her, had given her a jagged kind of courage. As she reached the marketing floor, the usual hum of keyboards and hushed gossip had vanished. People were standing in fragmented groups, their eyes darting toward the main conference room. Sienna didn't have to ask what was happening. She could see Gwen through the glass walls, her face a mask of saccharine confidence as she spoke to a group of internal investigators. But that confidence faltered the moment the elevator dings announced the arrival of the CEO. Kwon Tae-jin moved through the corridor with that same mechanical grace, but today there was a lethal edge to his composure. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the shifting chairs. His glacier eyes were fixed solely on the boardroom doors. He entered the room without a word, and through the glass, Sienna watched as the atmosphere turned from a routine inquiry into a crime scene. Earlier this morning, we completed a deep-dive forensic audit of our internal communications. Tae-jin's voice carried through the partially open door, calm and terrifyingly controlled. He placed a series of documents on the table with slow, deliberate precision. It wasn't just a leak. It was a lucrative offer from rival tech. Better roles, better pay, and a coordinated effort to pin the betrayal on a junior employee. Gwen's laugh was forced and sharp. "Mr. Kwon, surely you don't think—" "I don't think, Gwen. I know," Tae-jin interrupted, his voice dropping to a velvety, dangerous low. He slid a final document across the table. One careless message on an unencrypted line. 3 traceable bank transfers. You and Trudy got sloppy. The color drained from Gwen's face, leaving her looking older and far less impeccable. Trudy, standing beside her, began to tremble, her overcompensated smile finally shattering. They were caught in the very trap Tae-jin had set by allowing them to believe Sienna was the only suspect. The dragon didn't just fire them, he informed them that lawsuits were already being filed for corporate espionage and defamation. As security escorted the skank squad from the building, the office watched in stunned silence. Sienna stood by her desk, her hands clasped and her chest heaving. She felt a grounding pat on her shoulder. Adam, one of the few who had stayed silent during the accusations, offering a quiet sign of support. But her eyes were fixed on the corner office. An hour later, a private envelope was delivered to her desk. It was heavy, cream-colored, and addressed in Tae-jin's precise, elegant handwriting. Inside, there was no corporate jargon, only a single page and a legal deed. This land should never have been taken from you. It belonged to your father, to your family, and to the roots that made you who you are. Tae-jin had done the impossible. He had tracked down the installment agreement for her family's vineyard in Rowley, the acres that were being seized for unpaid taxes, and he had bought them back in her name. No strings attached, the letter concluded, no expectations, just truth. Sienna pressed the page to her chest and cried, not from the pain of the last week, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of a burden she had carried alone for years. She walked to the top floor one last time, the elevator opening to find Tae-jin standing by the window, his hands in his pockets as he watched the city skyline. When she thanked him, her voice steady but soft, he didn't flinch. "That wasn't a gift," he said, turning to look at her with eyes that were raw, open, and entirely human. He moved closer, the scent of sandalwood once again enveloping her. "I still want you, Sienna, but I want you to stand fully on your own first. When you're ready, I'll be here." Sienna looked at the deed in her hand and then at the man who had seen the fire in her late-night confession. She had her home back, her name was cleared, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the corporate grind, she was the master of her own horizon. 8 months had passed since the glass doors of Quan Enterprises had last closed behind Sienna Vale, a lifetime of growth distilled into a single vibrant season. The sterile, sandalwood-scented hallways of the city felt like a distant memory, replaced now by the earthy, honest aroma of oak barrels, lavender, and the sweet promise of second chances. Sienna stood at the center of the Vale vineyard, her auburn hair tossed by a gentle Rowley breeze and her round glasses catching the golden light of the setting sun. She hadn't just survived, she had flourished, securing a loan on her own name and her own terms to restore the land her father had once loved, while launching her independent firm, Sienna Vale Marketing. This wasn't a gift or a calculation, it was her empire, built with the firebrand spirit she had once used to slam a billionaire's door. The grand opening was a modest but magical affair, with twinkle lights crisscrossing the old wooden beams of the restored barn and acoustic music floating through the rows of blooming vines. Sienna moved through the crowd with a composed warmth, greeting guests like John, Adam, and Jennifer, who had all made the journey from Boston to witness her transformation. She felt a grounding sense of peace, knowing she had skin over her scars and a life that no longer depended on the approval of a locked vault. But her eyes occasionally searched the periphery, a habit she couldn't quite break despite the months of silence. As the evening deepened, Sienna stepped onto a makeshift podium to deliver her speech. Her voice was steady, lacking the waver that had once plagued her marketing presentations. She spoke of resilience and the way the land remembers us, but her voice softened as she reached her final point. "I want to thank someone who isn't here," she said, her cheeks flushing with a familiar pink warmth. "Someone who reminded me that if you're not willing to claim what's yours, you're not ready for a seat at the table, and who ultimately taught me that I could build my own." The applause was a roar of genuine support, but it was the silence that followed that made her breath hitch. Standing just beyond the edge of the light, alone and unannounced, was Quan Tae-jin. He wasn't the dragon in a charcoal suit tonight. He wore a crisp white shirt and a navy jacket, his slick black hair slightly softened by the evening air. Those glacier blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made the noise of the party fall away, a look that was unmistakably raw and open. He hadn't called or visited for 8 long months, though Jennifer had whispered that his yacht had been seen anchored off the coast twice that summer. He had stayed away, watching her from a distance as she walked her vineyard at sunset, wanting her to stand on her own feet before he dared to reappear. He had waited for her to choose her own path, and now as they walked toward each other slowly, the great silent bridge between them was finally being crossed. Neither spoke at first. Sienna looked up at him, her lips parted slightly as she searched the face of the man who had once been her boss and her greatest fear. She wanted to ask why he had stayed away, why he had let her fight this battle alone, but the answer was written in the way he looked at her, not as a superior, but as a man waiting for a choice. "I'm not going anywhere, Sienna," he whispered, his voice the same velvety low that had once made her knees weak. He didn't wait for her to apologize or explain. He leaned in gently and kissed her, a slow, certain, and devastatingly real kiss that melted the pain of the past 8 months in the heat of the Rowley sun. It wasn't a corporate calculation or a mafia test. It was a future beginning to bloom under the roots that once planted would never die. Sienna Vale had her vineyard, her name, and finally the man who had seen her long before she had seen herself.